Good morning. While we're sitting here, trees are growing. The resource of building material is growing there every second. And to me as a woodsman, I look at the possibilities that the different things we can make from the timber growing, but also how we can look after the environment by the way we build. Duncan mentioned sweet chestnut. Sweet chestnut's the main material I work with. It's a coppice material, and for those who are not familiar with coppice, it's basically where we cut down trees in the winter, and come the spring, they reshoot. So you get these shoots coming back out of the stump, and that in turn grows new poles, and we can harvest those and make things with them. So that's great. We get this resource of sustainable material. But what's really important is by being part of this system of harvesting these poles that we can use for building, we are actually increasing the biodiversity of our woodlands. Because when we let the light into coppice woodlands, you get the wild flowers that come. There you've got typical sort of ancient woodland wildflowers like early purple flowering orchid and bluebell. One in my woodland I'm working closely with is this one, the dog violet. And the dog violet is the food plant for this quite rare butterfly called the pearl-bordered fritillary. Why am I mentioning butterflies? Because by building with the materials that I have in my woods, we're able to create habitats for butterflies. And if we can make houses that help increase biodiversity and can support creatures like this, we've got to be heading in the right direction. So what does sweet chestnut offer? It offers poles of different sizes at different times we cut it. And the beauty of sweet chestnut is in the heartwood. The cream colour around the outside of that ring is the sapwood, that's non-durable. The dark bit in the middle is the durable heartwood. And chestnut grows heartwood very quickly and has very, very little sapwood. So one can actually joint together heartwood to heartwood connections in buildings quite easily. My first experiment really was when I built Woodland House, and this is now just about 15 years ago. And here's how it looks, well, last year. So it's mellowed a bit in time. But what really interests me about this is not the house, but is the actual stumps, the chestnut stools I cut the poles from. Because this is the very same trees that I built my house from 15 years on. And the oldest poles I used in the house were 30 years. So in another 15 years' time, I can go back to this and I can cut it again and I can build another house. So I'm getting a second house out of the same tree stumps that I cut the first one for my house from. And meanwhile, it will still be growing again. And then in 30 years' time, I can get 3 houses out of the same stump. And meanwhile, it will still be growing again. And by the time we go 30 years beyond that, I've got 4 houses and still out of the same tree, and it's still growing, and the butterflies are benefiting from it. So that's the basis of the importance of using this type of material. It is renewable, it is sustainable. It's very hard to argue against a material whereby you're actually getting multiple houses from the same trees. So how do we go about the actual building of houses like this? Well, I'm going to start with foundations. Foundations we use are basically non-concrete foundations. So we use a number of different techniques, but the main one we use is to dig a pit and fill the pit with some form of aggregate material. Now this can vary from local stone, it can be recycled material, we've used brick rubble, we've crushed old concrete and reused that. And then we lay on top a padstone material. And these can be surplus padstones, but they have to be a strong stone, or else they can be recycled padstones. And this we use as the main layout for the building. When we're digging that, we get soil. So what do we do with the soil? We use the soil in the building. So if we've got clay soils, we can mix up daubs and use them within the buildings themselves. The actual framing takes place on what we call a framing bed, which is a level platform that we build the frames on. And to construct the frames, we've developed some joints. Some of them are quite traditional, some of them have been adapted. And about 5 years ago, I got to the point where we got about 6 joints which were perfect for this sort of building. And then a couple of years ago, we looked at the whole thing and thought, this has got too complicated. We can actually do this with 2 joints. So the idea is you learn 2 joints and you can build your house. The first one is quite well known. It's a mortise and tenon joint. And here you can see it with in round wood with the tenon slotting into the mortise. Second is a little bit more unusual, and this is what we refer to as a butter pat joint, because the bottom part of it looks like a lump of butter in a butter dish. And it's actually a cog that when you lock the 2 pieces of wood together, you're transferring the weight of the roof of the building back down to the padstone. And yet, aesthetically, it looks like the 2 bits of wood have just been caressed together. And to build this, we use a scribing tool. These are quite common in log cabin buildings in Canada and Scandinavia. And by using a scribing tool, you can get a very accurate profile measurement of one log onto another. And then this is the internal part of the cog. And then when the 2 come together, pieces of wood fit nice and tight together. And then we finish them off with a peg, again made traditionally out of materials we got growing in the woods. We then raise the frames and construct from there any number of different scale timber buildings. Now, one of the things that's really interested me in what we've done is we've only so far done 2-story buildings, but we've got designs now for 4-story buildings. There is the possibility of using extra long poles, but the transport becomes difficult. So then we've got to look at reconstructing new frames on top of old frames. But the possibilities of building purely out of wood and building larger buildings if we need them is very possible. Once we've constructed the building, the coppice woodland provides us with a lot of other material. So how do we use that within the building? And one of the most used ones, I guess, is the chestnut shake, the roofing tile. Now the tile is cleft. In other words, it's not sawn, it's split. And by splitting it, you're basically prizing apart the fibres rather than sawing through the timber. The difference with that is that it sheds water much better and therefore it lasts longer. This is a building we built for the National Trust. And again, this is using a chestnut shaped roof. Here's the process of splitting them out. Using a tool called a furrow, we're actually prizing apart the fibres of the wood to create the shakes for the roof. This is my shed at the moment, full of shakes. We're currently making 50,000 of these for the new Weald Downland Gateway project at the museum in Singleton. But it's not just the shakes. When I show you this slide, you'll see again how the woodland element comes into the building. To the left of that, you're seeing chestnut laths. And now laths are used for traditional plastering. And again, they're split or cleft out of the heartwood. So we're using the big poles for the building, smaller sections to make the shakes. The laths for our walls if we're using lime or earth plasters. To the right, we've got cladding. That's actually oak. Now within the coppice woodlands, you have standard trees, taller trees above the coppice. And those, every sort of 30 or 40 years, you have to thin some of them out. And that's what we use for our cladding. And we also send some of that away to a local mill where it gets processed and kiln dried. And that's the material we make our doors, floors and windows out of. Everything else in the buildings we use is green wood. The doors, floors and windows we get seasoned. This is a little building we did in Partridge Green. This one, we've got a, not a cleft-shaped roof, but a sawn shingle roof. And the shingles on this roof are Western red cedar. But not Western red cedar coming from Canada, as you'll find in most of your builders merchants, but Sussex-grown Western red cedar. And we use that quite a lot because it's a very quick drying timber, so we can literally be milling up a log and be putting the shingles straight on the roof the next day. And this is the internals of that particular building, and give you a feel of how a roundwood building might be. This is at the Sustainability Centre. What was key to me in this building was the materials and where we were getting them from. There was a plantation that had never been thinned, about 200 yards away from where this building was, of Lawson cypress. And Lawson cypress is quite an unknown building material in this country. In America, it's known as Port Orford cypress, and it's a very durable timber. And it's lovely to work as well with a chisel. So materials from this were felled 200 yards away from the building site. The roof, again, we've gone for the cedar shingle. And another interesting component of where one can use timber in the buildings is in the walls. These are cordwood walls. Now, cordwood, especially softwood, has quite a good insulation value, and this is packed with clay, this one in between. But you can make the wall as thick as you like, just depending on what length you saw your log to. So this is a 18-inch or 450 mil thick log. So it's an option for walling. You can use the offcuts and the small bits of the timber to make your walls. When I'm designing a building or looking at it, I always work with a model. I'm not very good at working directly off plans, but if I can build it with sticks and poles, I can actually work out exactly what I need. And this project was for a local primary school, where the children actually had a major input in the design of the building, of what they wanted. And to me, that was a nice approach to look at getting the actual children involved in designing their schoolroom. We ended up with this sort of open-fronted building, which is used both as an outdoor classroom, but also as community theatre. And it's got lots of little quirky bits on it, sort of wobbly bridges and things as you approach it from different angles. But the key bit the children wanted was a sort of kind of underground space. And this I worked on. There was a big oak butt locally to this school, which had something called ring shake. Now, ring shake means that the tree, if you try and mill it up into timber, will fall apart. But kept in the round, it could be a really useful pillar in this building. So we utilised the oak butt and then created this cartwheel of chestnut to make the floor joist. So this is sort of underneath the underground space we created, all balanced on this one big oak butt. Then up above, we went for reciprocal frame architecture. Another really good opportunity for utilising round poles in design is the reciprocal style of roof. So the frames we're making now are a multitude of different sizes. There's a big demand for smaller buildings, micro houses, and these we can knock up frames very easily, and these can then be made into caravans or small scale dwellings for people to utilise. This is in my own village. It's a community village shop, and again we've used a whole variety of different materials straight out of the woodland. At the front there you've even got hazel incorporated into the building as the sort of wattle on the veranda. Now in the forest you get trees that don't grow straight, and foresters don't like straight trees, sawmills don't like straight trees, fencers don't like straight trees. Sorry, I got that the wrong way around. Don't like curved trees. So when you've got a curved tree, what are you going to do with it? Well, this is where I think we can really work with looking at the resource first before we actually design a building. What we're working on now is felling these curved trees. We can then map the exact profile of the curve we've got and design the building from the curve of the tree. So this is a process of going into the woodland, looking at what's growing there, taking a curved tree, felling it, measuring it exactly, and utilising that. So this particular curved piece of larch you're seeing there became the main ridgepole in this little curved studio we built. Well, there's a lot of surplus branches, small bits of wood that come out of the coppice at the same time. You can't use every bit in the building, but you can use the other bits to be part of the building, whether it's material for heating the building, whether it's creating a chair for sitting in the building. This is a table lamp designed by one of my apprentices, again, out of sweet chestnut, looking at how we can bring those coppice materials into our house. This is a bicycle bench made out of an oak tree that was so gnarly you could not mill it up, but it will sit there and quite happily and probably be there in 70 years' time. And the fencing around it, again, sweet chestnut coppice. Working in the woods and to get coppice materials into the mainstream and more into the building industry takes educating people at a lot of different levels. One thing we really need is to get more people out there working at the base end in the woods. Because across the southeast of England, we've got about 18,000 hectares of sweet chestnut coppice, and there's a large amount that's not being managed. If we can get that back into management, we're going to get better environments for our butterflies, for our wildlife, increased biodiversity, and we're going to have a range of materials we can start to build with. We then need to look at how we can get a new generation of people coming through who can build with these materials, because it's not always as straightforward as modern carpentry is these days. And then there's the actual process of cutting the joints and learning those. And that again needs a bit of education, but within 2 days I'm confident I can get most of you to be able to build a frame for a house. So it's not overcomplicated as long as the education is done carefully. And meanwhile, the trees have grown a little bit more in the woods while I've been talking. Thank you.